There are quite a few RPGs that grace the enormous NES library, and while turn-based combat can be a blast when it's done well, my heart is always best captured by action-adventure games. I've played a few so far that I've really enjoyed, but I was always curious about one touted to be one of the best by many people, Crystalis. The events that set the stage for the adventure are pretty grim. After a civilization was flattened to the ground by war, all technological advances in science were banished, forcing people back to a simpler time. This peaceful era lasted for 100 years until a magician named Dragon was tempted by the powers of the old ways. He combined the ancient technologies with his magic and crafted a machine that could emulate his own abilities, all in an effort to lord over other people in the realm. Some of the leaders of the land retaliated against Dragon's efforts by crafting 4 swords of the elements. When combined, they would form the only blade capable of defeating the rogue overlord, the Crystalis. Dragon realized this, but failed in his attempts to destroy the weapons. He was instead forced to hide them away and punished the leaders responsible by stripping them of their magical abilities. One day, while studying the ancient texts describing the Great War, the leaders came across a record of a valiant and powerful magician who died as a prisoner years prior. Seeing him as their only hope, they set out to find him and bring him back from the dead. And his are the shoes you step into as the player. The shoes of a hero who has long since lost his memory and has no idea about his destiny as the world's savior. The first few moments of the game do a good job of establishing this. You bust out of a sealed cave and scare the pants off of a nearby loiterer before you zombie on into town. In terms of skill or power, you've retained none of it from your former existence as a warrior and start out with no levels or belongings to your name. Thankfully, there are some nice people that have been expecting you, and after meeting a few of them and getting your first task, it's out into the wilderness to start the adventure. After beating up on a few of the local slimes and tiger dudes, you'll soon come to realize that there aren't really too many places that you can go at first. Most of the game unfolds this way. You'll reach a new region, but you can't go too much further ahead until you hit up a town and maybe a few caves for some plot-related triggers to unlock the next chapter. Saying that Crystalis is linear would be an understatement, but I actually really like when games are planned this way. I prefer it over a wide open world with several ongoing tasks, since that can get overwhelming pretty quick. Arbitrary blockades like a non-functioning windmill or a guy who wouldn't let me borrow his boat were good indicators that I'd left something undone, which helped me to stay on track. Thankfully though, you don't just shuffle between locations on a mindless journey that's completely prescribed. There are lots of things that embellish the quest, like a constant flow of townspeople, as well as places to scour for new items and secrets. Exploration and combat are the 2 main foundations of this game, and both demand some attention to detail if you're hoping to ever see the game's end. Making progress here follows the usual recipe of speaking to people to trigger quests and then venturing out to complete them. Now, even though what I was being asked to do was spelled out in plain English, I still found myself regularly losing track of a quest thread or two. I'm not sure if it was just me or if there was something occasionally lost in translation, but I can think of a couple of times where I completely and utterly stalled with no idea what to do. This is undoubtedly a note-taking kind of game where you'll need to include not only what your current task is, but also who you'll need to revisit when you find some other important stuff down the line. If you happen to forget some of those tidbits, you might find yourself stuck for hours until you stumble into the solution by accident. Lots of the game is linked together by various fetch questing, but honestly, some of this starts to feel tiresome pretty early on. The people in this realm are incredibly absent-minded. Almost every request involves someone asking you to find something they've lost, mostly because they can't be bothered to go out and look for it themselves. The number of people that need you to locate one of their misplaced yet extremely important personal belongings was staggering, to put it lightly. It didn't take me too long to start not so silently judging these folks for how irresponsible they were, and it made me start doubting whether they were even worth saving from the crushing reign of Dragon at all. But anyway, the reason I got so cranky at these people is because of how thoroughly you had to check places out. It's much more involved than just exhausting all the dead ends in a mazy cave looking for a big obvious chest. Plenty of lost items are just lying around in a random patch of land, and to locate them, you had to park your character in just the right spot, making finding stuff as unique as it was frustrating for me. In these situations, an NPC might indicate that they dropped something in a general space, like a nearby cave or near some water, and while you're searching around, there's nothing to let you know that you're in the right place to begin with, since there really aren't that many landmarks to go off of. There's not even any indication on the ground that something's hidden there either, so all you can really do is make an educated guess and cross your fingers that you'll find it. I will say that it could have been much worse, like needing to select search from a menu on every tile, like in Dragon Warrior or in the 7th Saga. But regardless, it did make quest hunting a lot bumpier. Once you know of course, but playing for the first time, I spent way too long hunting around, all the while doubting I was even in the right spot in the first place. At least the music was fantastic company while my brain was spinning on all these fetch quests. The soundtrack is easily one of the most memorable I've heard on the NES, especially because of how atmospheric it is. You fly between the adventurous, jaunty overworld tune to what plays in the creepy caves, which also conveniently reminds me of the theme from The Outer Limits. No matter where you find yourself going in Crystalis, the music is always right there to kick up the immersion to a higher level. Visually, the game is pretty nice as well. There's not a lot of sprite animation to speak of, and I couldn't stop gawking at the main character's putter feet, but the game's palette is bright and inviting as long as you're not deep inside one of the many brown caves with strangely colored walls. I would have liked a little more variety in those areas since you spend a lot of time roaming around in them. Save for the occasional shop interaction where you get into this neat little side view, the rest of the game plays from a top-down perspective. Whether you're roaming outdoors, visiting towns, or combing through caves, the action never really changes modes, so to speak. The main character's movement is zippy, and a tremendous improvement over other games like it, because you can actually move in 8 directions instead of 4. This makes for some fast-paced fighting. Lining up your weapon in games like The Legend of Zelda or Faria, A World of Mystery and Danger just pales in comparison to how sharp combat feels here. Whether I was attacking or sidestepping some of the faster flying enemies, I was glad for the extra pep in this little guy's step. The only time I found this speed annoying was trying to get around in tight confines with too many townspeople. Since conversations queue up by bumping into NPCs, it was a little too easy to initiate them unintentionally on the way by. While most of these folks will repeat their lines if you speak to them a second time, I was worried about accidentally missing something important by prematurely canceling some text I didn't mean to trigger in the first place. Thankfully, this never happened, but either way, I much prefer initiating conversation with a button press rather than smashing into people. A lot of the game's variety comes from its ever-changing enemy roster and how it's intimately tied to mechanics involving the 4 elemental swords. Monsters can be found in virtually every setting of the game, and you'll find yourself up against the usual array of forest friends and cave dwellers right alongside alien and fantasy monsters. While a couple of them have some tricks up their sleeves, most of them just walk menacingly towards you, if they even care at all. Other than those aerial enemies I mentioned, I didn't really find the actual act of combat all that engaging on its own. What made it compelling was derived from exploiting a fiend's elemental weaknesses and resistances, which is the game's main gimmick, so to speak. As you recover the different swords, you'll find that some of the weapons work against some monsters while others just don't at all. Now, while I thought that this was a neat aspect, its execution was a little uneven. It wasn't so bad when nearly all monsters in a single area could be hurt by one sword, which makes good logical sense if they're all living together in a similar climate or biome. But in this case, there were quite a few examples of monsters in the same place having different resistances, which forced constant weapon switching. And just to be clear, it's not that an incompatible sword does less damage than the best one for the job. The issue is that it won't even so much as put a dent in your opponent if it's the wrong one. To swap to a different weapon, you have to rummage through the menu every time, which I found really bogged down the flow of combat. It wasn't unbearable, but in the couple of places where literally every other enemy was invincible to one of your swords, it was far from pleasant. As a quick side note here, you might think it'd just be easier to run from the monsters you can't harm and focus on fighting with a single weapon instead. While that's definitely a strategy to consider, I didn't like leaving too many enemies alive. Grinding for experience is necessary, but I'll talk more about that shortly. I think the elemental mechanic might have been improved a lot if you could at least tell something about an enemy's alignment just by looking at it, like their color for instance. These little intuitive features just didn't exist here, meaning that trial and error was the only way to figure this stuff out. In the end, these are relatively small gripes that didn't really impact my overall opinion of the game, but if this is the worst part of the fighting, the best parts by far are the accessories that you can equip along with each sword. Finding the corresponding ball and bracelet meant that you could fire off a projectile by charging up an attack and releasing its fury from a safe distance. I loved this, and I leaned into it pretty heavily throughout the entire game. The only unfortunate thing about it is that some of the sword's best abilities use MP. I usually save most of my magic points for healing or teleporting back to town when I need to, but on the bright side, the MP-based moves are only accessible when you choose to equip one of the bracelets. I spent most of my adventure with them off, and I can't say how grateful I was that it was possible to play that way. If I'd been forced into a permanent upgrade after finding each bracelet and had to time my charge attacks to avoid using MP when I didn't want to, I would have loathed the fighting without question. To heap that much nonsense on top of what I already felt was a rather tedious experience with all the sword swapping may have pushed me over the edge, but thankfully that wasn't the case. While I didn't use them too often, I will say that the MP attacks definitely had their time to shine, but that was usually during rumbles with the various bosses. These encounters felt like chaos incarnate. Between the screen-filling projectiles, teleporting enemies, and the breakneck speed at which everything moves, it was really tough to keep up sometimes. I usually ended up stumbling into a fight, learning a little bit about it before quickly dying, followed by making the walk of shame back to try again. The dungeons and caves where these fights are located were often a long slog to make it through in one piece. Being a magician, you do eventually get that healing spell I mentioned, along with an assortment of others, just by moving through the motions of the plot. But I never felt like the MP pool was large enough for everything that I wanted to do. The base sword charges were usually more than enough to get the job done in regular combat, but I didn't hesitate to let loose with some offensive magic when it was called for. Now, I did touch on grinding earlier, and this game is far from free of it. Every enemy kill gets you a little bit of experience, and while the levels help by increasing your max HP and MP, the biggest benefit is really the money. There are a lot of things to pick up throughout the adventure. While you'll find much of it through exploring, most new towns present an exciting plot-related object that you'll need to advance, as well as fancy new equipment or restoratives to stock up on. And for those reasons, money was always the one limiting factor that saw me retreating into the wild to scout out the best grind spots. If I could fix one thing, it would be the crushingly small inventory, since I hate dropping perfectly good stuff when I run out of room deep in a labyrinth. Either way, I personally don't mind a grind, but it was a shame that the leveling didn't organically keep up with the pace of the game. This wasn't unusual for games of this era, but it would have been a nice surprise. At least when you went shopping, you had the advantage of not only knowing what you were looking at in the stores, but also what everything did because of the amazingly detailed manual descriptions. I do feel like the booklet gives a little bit too much away in some of these, but on the bright side, most of it only makes sense once you have the context of the game around you. Excellent manuals are truly hard to find, but this one's awesome. Crystalis is, without question, the most polished action RPG experience I've had on the NES so far. It's got everything you'd want from this genre, with great controls and innovative combat mechanics, even if the fighting itself can feel a bit stuffy once in a while. The cohesive storyline was also a major highlight for me. The ending didn't really wrap up everything as nicely as I might have wanted it to, but the journey from beginning to end was certainly a delightful one that supplied a good mix of humor and tension along the way. If you're planning to play any RPGs on the NES, this one's essential if you want to enjoy some of the best the system has to offer.